My pleasure to be back with you, talking about something I'm extremely passionate about, and that's the Pan-American Exposition. And I was with a group of Buffalo teachers about 2 weeks ago now, and we had a moment to talk about that question that every historian gets asked, which is, if you could, you have access to a time machine, but you can only use it once. You can go back in time for one day in history. Where would you go? Someone threw that to you. Where would you go? One day. That's it, though. Any moment in time, you go back to the Coliseum, you go back. Where would you go?
Crystal Beach and Erie Beach, 1920.
Nice. Ride the Canadian over to Crystal Beach? Or just go to Crystal Beach?
Crystal Beach and Erie Beach.
Okay, love that.
1928 specifically.
Why?
Because 1928 is when Erie Beach got the Wildcat, and the Cyclone was already at Crystal Beach for 1 year.
So a roller coaster day over there. Nice, love it. Where else? Where else would you go? Okay, I won't push real hard, but in talking with these Buffalo teachers, there was one guy who did say he would go back. He wanted to see the Coliseum, Gettysburg, go stand there when Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. And I realize right now it sounds like a cop-out because we're spending the next hour talking about the Pan Am, but I've always said from my beginnings as a local historian, and that was when I was 14, and that's a good story, but not to be told right now. I would go back to the Pan Am. I would spend a day on the Midway walking. And a day is not enough. A lot of what we really understand about the Pan Am comes from a series of journals written by a woman named Mabel Barnes. She was in her early 20s, Buffalo school teacher. She went to the Pan Am over 20 times. And she collected what I think is one of the most valuable collections of Pan Am ephemera, the stuff that people picked up and put them together in a 3-volume scrapbook. They're in the collection of the Buffalo History Museum. I'll show you a couple of pages at the end because they are now also digitized and online. So, talking and reading Mabel's scrapbooks, they're not really journals because she put them together over the years that followed. I don't know that a day at the Pan Am was enough, and many Buffalonians went multiple times because there was so much to see. And so what I want to do in the next hour is take you to the Pan Am, because often we do the 10,000-foot view. These were the buildings, they were temporary. The only thing that stayed was the Buffalo History Museum, but nobody ever talks about what did you really do there. This was an enormous space, and there was a lot of, more than I think you could do in a day. So my goal is to kind of walk you through the Pan Am grounds in the next hour. But understanding World's Fairs and where the Pan Am fits into that, I think is really important. Of course, I think it's important because it's my PhD thesis that I'm working on. But World's Fairs still exist. I think often we look at World's Fairs as kind of a was, but they still are. There are still World's Fairs. But we in the field, and that's why I'm actually working with a professor at the University of Reading in England, because her work is in like the next era. Mine is early fairs from the Civil War to World War I, what we call Victorian era fairs. They were the beginnings of shopping malls. We went to these expositions to see all of the new things that you could buy. They were set up as an educational tool as well. Although when we look at the educational piece today, we realize that it was in no way, shape, or form any way we would approach education. It was racist. It expressed right here from the logo on out a view of society that said all races and cultures are not equal, that our culture and our moment in time here in Buffalo in 1901 was superior. And so this is, I forget, my pointer doesn't work. Right, on the TV screen. So the logo here was designed by Lockport artist named Raphael Beck. If you've been to Lockport, to the Canal Discovery Center, there's a huge mural of the 5 lots. That was done by Beck. He went on to do other fair logos as well. The logo here from the Lewis and Clark exposition in Portland 4 years later was also done by Raphael Beck of Lewis and Clark and Lady Liberty looking out, across the setting sun in the Pacific Ocean. But the message that really the organizers wanted to emphasize is right here in the logo. So if you look, and it's not quite as large as I'd like it to be, but what do you notice is the logo of the Pan Am?
It looks like Americas.
Okay, so on one hand, we're looking at North and South America. Correct. exactly, the Western Hemisphere. Pan Am is going to show off the progress of the Western Hemisphere. Our progress, more so than others. But can you see what the two continents actually are? They're two women figures. So North America up here, so her head's right here and her arm is reaching down. Talk about that in a minute. And she's got like this flowing yellow dress. And then down here, you have another female figure. This is South America, and she's got like a pink dress on. And one of the papers at the time, when they saw the formal logo, wrote, oh, it was Buffalo Express who wrote, our South American sister is most gracefully represented as reaching up to us. There's no question, we are not on par, all right? We're reaching down to lift up Central and Southern America, but we're gonna put them on display, but in a way that is not on par with everybody else. So this was the formal logo. You find it everywhere. I have it on a pin back. I've got it on a paperweight. This is a mailing card that was very, very common across the Pan Am grounds, but designed to reinforce this, the focus of the Pan Am, that we're going to show off what's best about North America in the Western Hemisphere, but not on an equal footing. It's that idea of social Darwinism, that societies progress and evolve over time, just like Darwin said, people had evolved over time. This is perhaps certainly the more picturesque of the logos. It is not the official one. The Beck logo with the two continents is the official one, but this is the one that over time we've really gravitated towards. The Spirit of Niagara, done by Evelyn Rumsey Carey. Her husband, the architect George Carey, designed the Buffalo History Museum, and it's a take on the myth, the legend of the Spirit of Niagara. The female figure in the midst of the falls, the Pan Am, is visible behind the rainbow, and that's important because when we talk about designing the Pan Am, rainbow color is going to be important, as is electricity. Why Buffalo? The Buffalo organizers had started in the mid-1890s vying for a World's Fair, an exposition here in Buffalo. The whole World's Fair thing starts in the United States in 1876. There's a World's Fair or a Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Buffalo. But the big one in this era is Chicago in 1893, what's called the Columbian World's Fair. Now, it was to celebrate the 400th anniversary, is my math right, 1892. So 400th anniversary of Columbus landing. But it was in 1893, my math is not wrong, they took longer to build it, and so it opened a year late. But that was the big World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, the White City. You may have read Eric Larson's book, Devil in the White City, about the serial killer that was in Chicago during the same time as the World's Fair. Really good read if you haven't read it, based on actual events. But that becomes kind of the landmark World's Fair. Huge. That's where the Midway, the Midway's there. It's where Grant Park is, and what it was where Grant Park is in Chicago today. And so every fair that came after was either going to emulate Chicago or try and outdo Chicago. We're in the outdo category. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Buffalo is the 8th largest city in 1900. But there's a myth. It's funny, a good friend of mine, Tony Greco, who's the director of exhibits, Buffalo History Museum, was on a podcast last week talking, and the same thing came up. We run into this sort of mythology that Buffalo held Pan Am because we had more millionaires than any other city in the time. And we in the field have no clue where that came from. Because we know it's not true. We probably had in the ballpark of, I have notes on this because it's one of the things I want to get right. We probably had, in a city of about 300,000 people, about 50 millionaires. So where the number 22 comes from, none of us can figure out. But compared to New York City, they had over 1,000 millionaires. So will somebody say, well, maybe it's per capita because they had millions of people and we had about 350,000. It's not a per capita thing. We just don't know where that number comes from. But that doesn't change the fact that in 1900, when we were the 8th largest city in the United States, we had an immense amount of wealth. Think of the mansions on Delaware Avenue. And those families in those mansions wanted to use this World's Fair to bring people to Buffalo and to showcase this wealth that had accumulated because of the Erie Canal, because of the Great Lakes, because of the railroads that followed the canal into Buffalo, the grain elevators, the industry. I was just on with Penny Wolfgang yesterday on her radio show. We were sort of talking about how this all, steamrolls towards the Pan Am through the 1800s. And this is our chance to show that off. We were a day's travel for over 40 million people. It was, 20 million had come to the Chicago World's Fair. So Buffalo estimated we could easily do that, maybe a little bit less. In the end, only about 8 million people came to the Pan Am, about half of what was expected. A variety of reasons for that, and when we get into some of the images, we'll talk about that as well. But this was our moment on the stage. And we look back and sort of think about the Pan Am as perhaps a qualified failure. We lost a president here. It did not draw the people that was expected. It wound up in debt over $2 million when it was done. That was unaccounted for. Now, don't worry, all those people in the mansions on Delaware, they got their money back. No surprise, government bailout. But the average person, one of the things I have hanging on my study wall is a stock certificate from the Pan Am, because they went and sold stock to the average person. It's going to be this great success, this showcase. Buy stock and you'll know I'm the kind of guy who lost, but all the millionaires, they were made whole by the government for the bailout. So, but it was seen as a success at the time, that this did what the organizers wanted, putting Buffalo in the best, in this light, in a showcase. And that people came, realized that, especially from the standpoint of electricity, that this was the future. And they had come to the Pan Am and they had seen the future. Couple of things that you'll see. This is the Pan Am flag. Adelaide Thorpe was the designer of the flag. And it's important to look at the symbolism, because in one flag, you incorporated a color that is in every flag of every country in the Western Hemisphere. But more than that, in the blue, you have the single star, which represents, anybody?
Texas?
Well, no, but that's an excellent thought. That's a really great thought. No, think of Western Hemisphere. North America and the North Star. In the red field, you have what's called the Southern Cross, which is visible only in the Southern Hemisphere. And then in the middle, you have the eagle, which represents Mexico. The legend of how Mexico, the Aztecs settled where they did was there was a eagle that landed on a cactus eating a snake. Why those things, don't know. But the eagle, of course, is a symbol across the continents as well. So it goes in the middle, and the banner that the eagle is holding says Pax 1901. So peace of 1901, this, sort of portrayal, having just come off a war with Spain, that the countries of the Western Hemisphere for this moment exist in peace. You see it everywhere. This is the Minnesota building, and you see the large version of the flag stretched out across the portico. The History Museum has a flag of that size. There are differing sizes of them, but 2.5, 3 weeks ago, the History Museum had our members event, annual membership meeting, and they had stretched out and hanging in the great court, the state court, one of the original Pan Am flags of the size. And to see it from 125 years ago, in scale, is really pretty cool. Now, you may start to see these, which is our take for the 125th anniversary of the Pan Am. These are going to be street banners that are going up. We're working right now with the city of Buffalo. We're hoping by, where's some wood? By July 4th, it's the city, one never knows, but we're working to have these banners installed in the Heritage District, Elmwood, Delaware, Great Arrow, Nottingham, Lincoln, so where the fair itself was, and along Delaware near the Teddy Roosevelt site. But it's our take on the Pan Am flag, replacing the eagle with the buffalo and making this a marker of where the Pan Am took place for us here in Buffalo, in Western Europe. All right, let's talk a little bit about the grounds, and then I have video now. So the Pan Am grounds stretched over a mile from what is today Hoyt Lake. So it stretched a mile from Hoyt Lake on the south all the way to the belt line, to where if you drive Delaware or Elmwood, there's the viaduct where you're going to the railroad. That was the north end of the Pan Am grounds. So that was a mile north to south, about a half mile east to west if you go across Amherst Street, which would be right about 2/3 the way up. The fair was laid out, we refer to it as an upside down T. Okay, so here's your long axis, here's the short axis. Across the short axis, you had two large buildings that anchored it, horticulture on this side, US government on this side. But the whole goal, the Pan Am, and it's in looking at the World's Fairs of this era, it's the only one that really put sort of this social Darwinism right out front and center. You open the guidebook, the official guidebook to the Pan Am, it talks about sculpture, talks about color, and it talks about sort of the structure of progress. So the goal was you entered through the Lincoln Park gate, which was down here. It's about where the Rose Garden is today, across from the Albright Knox. And you were to either cross, you could go to the casino, which we say the History Museum is the only building. Casino was there too, looked very much like it does today. You could rent a motor launch, or you could rent a gondola. A gondolier would pull you across the lake singing as he went. Or you could go by foot across the bridge that's right in front of the art gallery. Most of us miss it because we're trying to get onto the Skajak and not get like T-bone. But there's a bridge there, and that bridge was built by the city for the Pan Am. I'll show you a picture of it again. So you cross from nature, from the trees and the lake. You get over to an area here called the approach. Was like a statuary garden. But again, you were still in nature. So you're moving from nature, you cross then a triumphal bridge. And again, show you pictures of this in a minute with these huge pillars. Now you've moved into sort of the beginning of progress. And then down here in the southeastern corner is where you had all of the South American countries and the Central American countries, Guatemala, Mexico, Ecuador, and they were painted in very stark, very harsh colors. And as you move, the colors sort of modified. They get lighter, they get softer, until you get all the way up to here where the electric tower was. The electric tower, and I know we looked at the NIMO Tower downtown, it was an honor of, it was an homage to, but it didn't look exactly like the electric tower at the Pan Am. The electric tower was as tall as City Hall. It was temporary. They built it in a year and a half, the height of City Hall, with the intention it was not going to be there after the Pan Am. But it was painted in this gold, ivory, sea foam. It was the pinnacle. So you move from the harsh, stark colors of the less developed societies through the progress of North American society until you get to the electric tower, where the colors change to sort of this, the gold of the promise of electricity. I wanted to mention something. Okay, so the Pan Am grounds themselves are surrounded by a canal that was over a mile long. And not only could you take a gondola across the lake, but then you could rent in the concession Venice in America. You could rent gondolas there, or you could rent an electric motor launch, which held more people. If you've ever been in a gondola, it's an experience, but I would not say pleasure. I kept thinking we were going to tip over into, the canals of Venice when I was on one. But this is the neat thing. During the Pan Am, Edison Corporation came to the Pan Am a couple of times. And while Thomas Edison himself he died not too many years after the Pan Am, the company came with an electric movie camera. And while, of course, it's silent, you'll get it. We have these videos preserved by and accessible through the Library of Congress. And so we're in a motor launch. You can see the captain with the white hat here. We've started in Venice, America. This is horticulture behind us. Let me see if I can pause without. Brilliant. Okay, so we are headed north towards the Midway. The thing you see there that looks like a gigantic wheel on an arm, that is our version of the Ferris wheel. So remember, everything was going to be better than what was taking place in Chicago. So in Chicago, George Ferris had built a wheel. So we were going to have a wheel that was a little bit bigger. This was 15 feet taller. Chicago was the white city. Ours was the rainbow city. Chicago did have some electric lights. We were going to have over 250,000 electric light bulbs illuminating the electric city. So everything a little bit better, including our Ferris wheel. You'll see as we get going here, the flag right in front of the bridge. There's the Pan Am flag. I'm always amazed by these bridges because remember, all the buildings are temporary. Talk a little more about construction in a minute. But, here's this horse and wagon. We'll see another one a little further on. Gondola coming towards us. And we're headed towards the midway as we pass under this bridge. Notice the wind. We talk about why did the attendance of Pan Am fall short. The weather that summer was horrible. We opened late because the winter had caused us to fall behind in construction. During the summer, the weather was, you can see the trees along darkest Africa here, just sort of almost doubling over in the wind. So many of the pictures we've used in the current work we're doing right now, there was rain every day. And that took its toll on the buildings that were temporary, but it also kept attendance down a little bit. So we're headed now towards darkest Africa. The classic looking building beyond it is a different concession called Old Plantation South. I'll show you pictures of both of those in a minute. Unfortunately, Edison did not capture the aerocycle, our Ferris wheel, in action, which is too bad. We do have some nighttime pictures of it. This is McGarvey Streets of Mexico. There were bullfights at 4 and 9. I'm fascinated by that fact because that meant the nighttime one was done under some sort of electrical stoplights. This is the electric. So now we've turned along Midway. Electric tower, you get a sense of how large it is here to the left. We're now moving along some of the large buildings like this would be probably machinery and transportation. Again, another horse and wagon. So all of these supplies, there was one chain of restaurants called Bailey's Catering that actually had their kitchen on the north end, and then they distributed the food to 8 different restaurants throughout the grounds. And all of this that you're seeing that looks like carved stone or, designed stone, that's all a material called staff. It was I can say this to you, my 7th grade students would never understand. Remember the big chalk we used to have in class? Yeah. It was kind of like that. So it was a mixture of gypsum, horsehair, plaster. It was applied to a scaffolding, and then you could precast it. So in the museum collection, they have buffalo heads that were precast. So we're now behind the electric tower, what's called the plaza. There's a bandstand, a huge restaurant, and then we're actually looking at an entrance to the stadium. But all of that detailing, all of that frill on these buildings is made out of this temporary material called staff, which is one of the reasons that by October, the buildings were starting to show their wear and tear. This was not a permanent material. So as it's raining, as it's, all of that's getting in, and chunks of the building are beginning to fall off. We'll go just a bit further here. One of the goals of having the canal, though, it also aided in, once the Pan Am was over, that land had to be returned to the Rumsey family in the condition it had been leased from originally, which meant all these buildings, all of the debris had to be gone. So one of the things is they pushed a lot of it into the canals, covered it up, gone. So those videos, these videos, I'm going to show you another Edison video a little bit later, are available through the Library of Congress and really give us a sense of, to the extent you can, what it really looked like back in the day. So along the 2 sides, on the left you have Elmwood, on the right you have Delaware. And so the majority of people did not actually experience the Pan Am coming through and going from nature through the less civilized to the electric tower. They took the streetcar and came in the gates at Amherst Street on Delaware and Elmwood, the majority of people. So that whole process kind of didn't really go the way planners envisioned. This is an image of one of the sculptures. There's an entire handbook of the art and especially the sculpture and how it progresses. So had you come in the way you were supposed to, through the Lincoln Gate and across the lake, you first encountered a statue of George Washington. It's not a mistake that George Washington was first. Then you move through the statuary. As you get into the countries of South America, it's about labor and manual labor and physical labor. And then the further up you move, it becomes progress and science and knowledge until you get to the electric tower, where all the sculpture actually represents their allegories of the Great Lakes. Over here, you see one of 2 band shells. So music was a big part. We think of the Temple of Music because of the assassination, but music was, and sound was a constant. I was walking the district, so the Heritage District, about a week ago, counting light bulbs to put our banners on. And you know, I had that moment to stop and think about, you know, I was on the Midway area, so what would that have sounded like? My wife, strangely, before we knew each other, had actually written her master's thesis on music. She's a music teacher, so she'd written about music and the soundscape of the Pan Am. So you had bands like John Philip Sousa and formal performances in the bandstands, and then you had ethnic performances. There were street orchestras in Mexico. There was a band. Every ethnic concession on the Midway had their own sound, and so that just must have, I think, have been overwhelming. This is the Triumphal Bridge. Those pillars, each over 100 feet tall, crowned with equestrian statues. What we miss often, because of the height of the pillars, is they had these large victory medallions hanging across. And then on the top, there were inspirational inscriptions by a writer, Richard Watson Gilder, who wrote for New Century Magazine. And we have the text of all those. There's Richard Watson Gilder left a sort of like a compilation of his writings, and he left the Pan Am inscriptions in there. And of course, the ever-present gondola there in the middle of the lake. That lake, let me go back, because people always ask, this lake that you're seeing here is not White Lake. This is not Delaware Park Lake. So within the canal structure, they built on the southern end of the what's called the Esplanade, these two reflecting lakes or mirror lakes. So when you're looking at this gondola here, that's within the Pan Am grounds, not the lake outside that exists today. So anchoring the T on one end, you had what's called the horticulture grouping. In the big building, you had horticulture displays. I'll show you a couple in a minute. Then you had graphic arts and mines. It's hard to really get a sense of what the buildings look. I mean, yes, we know what the buildings look like in day, night, but the color is what escapes us because we were 25 years away from color photography. So there are a couple of ways we get a handle on this. The History Museum has in its collection some oil paintings by John Ross Key, the grandson of Francis Scott Key, actually, who came and painted different scenes of the Pan Am in color. They're not as historically accurate always as I would like, but they're a good view. These are mailing cards that you could buy on the Pan Am grounds. There were souvenir stands all over the place. And they are in color and give us a little bit more of a sense of what the buildings look like. The red tile roof Spanish Renaissance architecture was the design as kind of a nod to our Southern American cousins. Not every building followed the plan, but most did. And it gives you a sense of, you know, there was color to these buildings. That's why it's the Rainbow City. That's why it's a reaction to what had come 10 years earlier in Chicago. Now, what did you see inside? So, as you would expect in a horticulture building, we always say it's like the Erie County Fair on steroids, right? So very, very similar. Within the large horticulture building, there were states and foreign countries that had exhibit space. One of the most popular was California, and there are a couple of really cool things to point out here. Number one, now, it's California. I've been to California. I'm sure many of you have as well. There are no elephants in California. So why California and Los Angeles County chose a large elephant made of California walnuts is beyond me, but they did. And it's not just here. We've got a picture of the same elephant 3 years later in St. Louis at the St. Louis World's Fair. The elephant's there as well. Over here, now I caught this a couple of days ago when I was pulling some research together. Over here, so if you notice, this looks like the front of a California mission. Okay. And you'll notice right over here on the left, there's a bell. That bell was made out of prunes, California prunes. And the one thing I've never been able to find at any of the Los Angeles County displays at any of the World's Fairs, they had a grizzly bear made out of raisins, California raisins, of course. But we did find pictures of the mission bell and of the elephant, but I'm still hoping someday I'm going to find the grizzly bear made out of raisins. So this was a chance to showcase your produce. My family is from Chautauqua County, so I was pleased to see a whole column of Chautauqua County wine. which I don't know would stand up very well with Napa, but it's a whole different thing. This would have been in the fall because this is a table full of peaches. There are grapes here. So this was really a chance for states and countries to showcase their horticultural wares. Now, across the T, you had the government building. Now, if horticulture and everybody was supposed to be Spanish Renaissance architecture, does this look Spanish Renaissance? It does not. James Knox Taylor, who was the government architect and actually designed the post office in Buffalo, which is the ECC city, decided to go and do what he wanted. So he built a dome over 200 feet tall. It's red, white, and blue. Totally disregarded all of the directions from the Board of Architects at the Pan Am. But this gives you an idea, again, of scale of these buildings, all of these temporary. In the foreground, again, you'll notice the flag. You notice, in this case, a little easier to see here, there were 2 band shells across the esplanade, across the bottom, between horticulture and government. This one with chair setups, this one with a concert going on because you can see people there in front of the band shell. Now, this gives you an idea of what, and we could lose ourselves because the government display, I'm fascinated by it. But remember, we had just come off a war with Spain that had created the beginnings of the United States Empire in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So war material was a big part of the government display and was fascinating to the people who came to Pan Am. Outside the government building was this display of coastal artillery, these 12-inch guns that were in these concrete pits. They would raise them, pretend to load them, lower them back down. There were displays constantly. In the building, we found a picture, it's not great, so I didn't throw it in. One of the things that many people commented on was a table about twice this size, and it had a map of the world on it. And on the table were little battleships. And daily, the people in the government building would move the battleships to show where the American fleet was at any time during the Pan-American Exposition. People write about seeing this table and being, really captivated by it. The Smithsonian had a large display. Now, Tony and I, we've included this in the touchscreen that I'll talk about at the end. We are not 100% convinced that that's actually a Triceratops skeleton. We know by this point, by 1901, that actual dinosaur skeletons, fossils, were being recovered out in the West. But in looking at this, and we got this from the Smithsonian, they just don't look, the head, the ribs, they just don't look real. So whether it was the way they were cast or however, I'm not convinced that's an actual Triceratops. But nonetheless, it captivated people who had, read about the bone wars out in the Great Plains, and now we're getting a chance to see some of these dinosaur fossils, if they were, right up close. The Smithsonian display was pretty well criticized by people who came as being very, static. So lots of display cases, lots of stuff to look at, not lots of stuff to do. There were other areas where there's plenty to do, but not in the government building. There were displays of every coin that had been printed, every dollar that bill that was in circulation. The Weather Service had a spot in the government building, and they produced a daily weather map. Next to my worthless Pan Am stock, my weather map is one of my favorite artifacts. It's huge. It's framed on my wall. It's gigantic. But it's from August of 1901, and you would go through and they would hand out these weather maps of what tomorrow's weather would be like. And a number of them have survived over time to be a really neat artifact. And there was in the back, you can see the patent office had a display. And in the patent office was a new medical device that was just being sort of in its infancy, the X-ray machine. Tuck that away for about 10 minutes. Ethnology was this, as I said, education. It was come and buy things or come and figure out what you want to buy. It was also come and learn. Not in a way we would find acceptable today. The artifacts in the ethnology building were very often taken from indigenous sites. There were Chilean mummies that had been taken out of a burial cave in Chile. There were artifacts from the Indian mounds in South Central Ohio that had just been dug up and were on display. But one of the neat things that, again, in my day at the Pan, I wanted to make sure I see, The floor of the ethnology building was a map of Western New York, complete with running water. And it showed all of the sites at that point in 1901 that had been identified as an indigenous site in Western New York. Second floor had a walk around art gallery again, portraying the evolution of different races and different societies over time. This gives you a much better idea here of color as we begin to move up the Esplanade. Opposite the ethnology building, you have the Temple of Music on the west side of the Court of Fountains. This is what it looks like at night. And then on the main stretch of the Court of Fountains, you have four large buildings that anchor it. Manufacturers and liberal arts, electricity, agriculture, transportation. You had everything from a Pierce Arrow, the early Pierce Arrow automobiles. We were just talking yesterday on a Zoom I was on about steam engines that were built at the works in Schenectady, New York. You know the big train's coming next week? 2 weeks? It's 2 weeks. 2 weeks from yesterday. The largest, the 4014, one of the largest functioning steam engines. It was made in Schenectady, but not for the Pan Am. It's coming to Buffalo and will be here in Cheektowaga a week from Wednesday. So you can see all that. But in the manufacturing and liberal arts building, as I said, this was the beginning of, a really pushed consumer culture. And a lot of people say this was the beginning of sort of the proto mall, where you went into the manufacturer's building and you could see all sorts of things. Scale is always staggering to me. When you look at the size of the people here compared to the doorways, and all of these buildings had these just gigantic entranceways that dwarf the people that came in to see them. What did you see inside? Again, this is why you couldn't do the Pan in a day, just to go through the exhibits. There were, Singer Sewing Machine had a huge exhibit, Underwood typewriters. Tiffany Glass was here with Tiffany windows and a gigantic Favril glass fountain that operated within the Manufacturing Liberal Arts building. This is a yachting trophy by Gorham, a rival of Tiffany's, that was done for the World's Cup. There was a ceremonial sword for Admiral Dewey. Heinz had 3 exhibits, in case you needed ketchup or pickles. And I love this one. This is a corset company. Yeah. And so this actually showed how they steamed the corsets to get them set, but without commentary, just notice how small those waists are. Different time. That's all I'm going to say about that. So Charles Rolfs, the local furniture maker, had his exhibit in the Liberal Arts Building. And in fact, he actually won an award and was invited to go display his work at an arts and crafts display in Turin, Italy, because he had displayed his stuff here. Electricity. So on one hand, we are the Rainbow City, as opposed to Chicago's White City, but it's also about electricity. Leading up to the Pan Am, there had been a great deal of competition between Edison and direct current, DC, and Tesla and alternating current, what are called the current wars. By 1897, that had pretty much been resolved, but that's only, the planning for the Pan Am is underway by 1897. And cities, municipalities had all gravitated toward Tesla's alternating current, which came at a higher voltage. I may get the terminology wrong, I'm a historian, but came at a higher voltage wattage through the line, but then had to be stepped down to usable levels, in this case, once it got to the Pan Am grounds. But all of those lights are going to be powered by power coming from Niagara Falls. And so the scale of electric power here, as we said, is different. Power at Chicago or other fairs where there had been electrical lights was largely coal-powered generating plants, but we're going to feature the falls and power coming from that. It allowed for an interesting souvenir. I should have thrown it in my bag, but a lot of the souvenirs at Pan Am were aluminum. So you could buy napkin rings. I've got a set of salt and pepper shakers, because aluminum required it required a lot of electricity to make. And so not only could aluminum now be produced because of the power coming from the falls, it could be produced cheaply enough that you could buy it on the Pan Am grounds as a souvenir. But in addition to the falls itself, the electricity building, that's what it looked like, with all sorts of different, GE, Westinghouse was a huge display here at the electricity building. But in the basement were the step-down transformers for the power coming in from Niagara Falls. Those became very popular because in a cold and wet summer, visitors to Pan Am grounds would go into the basement of the electricity building and hang out near the transformers because they were warm. It's not exactly, I don't think, how the planners envisioned it. And as we said, at the pinnacle, you have the electric tower. It is one of the few buildings that had a steel substructure. The majority of these buildings, if we go back, these are wooden frame. Then they're covered with small pieces of wood called lath. That lath is then plastered by workers who traveled city to city doing the work on these World's Fairs. So from here, they went to Charleston. They come from Nashville, if I'm not mistaken. So they would just travel and do these, do the staff work building these temporary buildings. Electric tower, because of its height at over almost 390 feet, had to have a steel structure. It also made it one of the last places you wanted to be during a thunderstorm because you had a 400-foot lightning rod at the north end of the Pan Am. But it's interesting because there is a guy who's written a book about 5 years ago about how all the World's Fairs were fit. And it's a nonsense thesis. But it's interesting because he said, well, you could never have done, the work could not be done in a year and a half. We've got binders of pictures of the work being done. The workmen building the Pan Am. And I love this with all the workmen in front of the scaffold, still on the electric tower itself. In the forecourt, you had fountains. In the center, you had a waterfall that was over 75 feet tall that represented Niagara Falls. The statuary along this colonnade was an allegory of all of the different Great Lakes and how they fed into the power that was being generated for the Pan Am. So this is not an unusual one, but I do want to point out a couple of things. This is very common because it's three women. This gets used a lot, but these are light standards. And actually at the History Museum in the collection, they've got one of the heads of one of these lamps with all of the light bulbs attached to it. And then of course, we really need to look at it at night. Now I said Edison did not capture the aerocycle in motion. This picture did. We didn't notice it until we were pulling for the touchscreen project we're working on. Back here is one, well, actually you can see both arms of the aerocycle. But because of the time delay exposure to get all the lights, it actually caught the motion of this arm going down and this arm coming up with sort of that blur of, because of what cameras were back in, and probably get a similar blur in today, modern cameras. But Edison also captured this for us. And as we watched this one, it's important to realize that it wasn't just throwing a switch. They didn't just throw the lights on. The lights were on dimmers. They were on rheostats, much like I imagine going to Walt Disney today. And so it wasn't like all of a sudden the lights came on when it got dark, but the lights were gradually, slowly faded in as the sun set until you reached a point where all of a sudden you became aware that you're surrounded by light. And there are accounts of people standing in the court of fountains, looking at all of these lights, just weeping because they couldn't believe that this was what was happening. Electric lights weren't new, but they weren't common. People in Delaware, the mansions in Delaware Avenue had electric lights. But the average person that came to the Pan Am was still probably lighting their home with oil lamps of some kind. So to see lighting on this scale was staggering. And so Edison doesn't capture sort of the fade, but he captures the transition of what this looked like to people who went to the Pan Am. So this is he's panning from government. This is ethnology. Here's the bandstand in front. You can see the light poles. And now we're looking down the forecourt past manufacturers and agriculture towards the electric tower here. And now you'll see the changeover to what? The spotlight could be seen as far away as Niagara Falls. Yeah. As I said, the only analogy I've got in my toolbox is it's like going to Disney World. And that's not a totally, that's Temple of Music, by the way, which we're getting to. It's not a totally inaccurate analogy. Walt Disney, in a lot of ways, what we see at these World's Fairs is foreshadowing what's going to happen with Disney and his experience. He grew up in Marceline, Missouri, not too far from an amusement park based on the Chicago World's Fair. In the 1930s, he went to a World's Fair in San Francisco, was fascinated by like miniatures and dioramas. And then in the 1960s, Disney is engaged by the World's Fair planners in New York to do Small World, Lincoln, the animatronic Lincoln, and World of Motion, if I remember right. So several of, and we're going to see this on the Midway, that many of the attractions have a really very Disney feel to them in terms of sort of that immersive moment. So there is a connection, in my way of thinking, between World's Fairs and eventually how they influence Disney. And you can look back on the World's Fairs and go, oh yeah, that's Pirates of the Caribbean. I'll show you that in a minute. There was a stadium at the back end that held over 10,000 people. They ran track meets, they played lacrosse, UB played football there. There were sham battles between the cavalry and the Indians. No surprise, the cavalry won all the time. Biggest event that filled the stadium was a Zangerfest, a German singing festival, where German singing choirs were brought and filled the stadium, both with the choirs and with the people that came to see them. Buffalo at that point, 1900, still heavily German in its population. Conrad Diehl, the mayor, is not the last German mayor of Buffalo. Oh, this is fun. In the back, that's not a moon, that's a captive balloon. There was a captive balloon in the back corner. For a long time, we weren't sure it was actually there. We knew that it was in the planning, it shows up on the map, but lots of stuff shows up on the map that it didn't actually make it to the ground. But in our research, we found pictures. We have pictures of people in the captive balloon. If you've never been in a captive balloon, I would not say it's a fun experience. I made my family do it when we were in Florida a couple of years ago. There is a captive balloon at Disney Springs. You go up about 1,000 feet, but you're tethered, which on a day like this where it's nice and still is fine. But if there's a breeze, you're kind of like on a metronome. And if you have any sense of motion discomfort, not the place to be. And in the summer that we saw with that wind, you would not have paid me to go up in the captive balloon, let alone pay to go up in the captive balloon. The big attraction, though, for lots of people was the Midway. First Midway had been at Chicago. That's where the name comes from, the Midway play sounds. But it became something that every World's Fair following had to have. It was part Crystal Beach. If we go back to that analogy, it was many of the exhibits had an educational aspect, but not in a way that, as I have said, makes us comfortable today. They were racist in their design, intending to show less advanced races and less advanced civilizations. At the same time, it also was a chance for people in Buffalo to encounter things that they would never have a chance to see in their lives in the day before the internet, television, radio. It makes discussing the Midway problematic. Dreamland was a Hall of Mirrors, said to have been an influence on the Funhouse over Crystal Beach, speaking of. There was a parade. I think this gives us a sense of how many of these foreign cultures were portrayed. The term they used was Eskimo. It's not a term we use today. It translates roughly as eaters of raw flesh or raw fish. So we use the term Inuit. That's the term for the indigenous people of Newfoundland and Greenland. That's where these performers came from. But they were forced to wear sealskins to float. This is the parade down to Main Street to the Pan Am grounds. We're actually right outside Central Library. This building here behind the float, this would be Liberty Bank. Just kind of, we know right where we are located here. So this is, you can see the antlers, you can see them dressed in their sealskins. The float itself designed to look like an iceberg. Very stereotypic in the representation of these cultures. So we didn't know which concession this was. I am 90% sure this was actually Cleopatra. There was the Temple of Cleopatra on the Midway. She was pulled by a large number of African Americans. It's reported that way in the paper. And there's some interesting and slightly off-color reporting that ties this to the actual, so why we think it's Cleopatra. These, of course, are indigenous people. These are Native Americans from the Great Plains. If there's a saving grace to this, The Plains Indians were displayed at what's called the Indian Congress, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. But there was an understanding by the organizers that the Haudenosaunee of New York State were not the same as the Great Plains. And so there was a Six Nations area over, where the old house is on Delaware. It says, the Pan Am House. We actually think that was on the Pan Am grounds. I came across a newspaper article as they were developing that area for the Six Nations and where they were going to build the longhouse and the stockade. They wrote about a building that was on site and how they covered it with bark to fit into the the Haudenosaunee exhibit in that corner of the Pan Am. So it is, in fact, very possible that that building not only was on the grounds of the Pan Am, but was probably part of the Six Nations exhibit at that corner of the grounds as well. So Indian Congresses are kind of an offshoot of Buffalo Bill. So he's over there on your right, Buffalo Bill Cody. So he had begun the Wild West show back even before the first World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876, recreating his interpretation of the events that involved him on the Great Plains as a cavalry scout, as what they called an Indian fighter back then. Of course, not a term we would use today. But his Wild West show was performative. It was, the cavalry always won. They got there in time to rescue the homesteaders from the Native Americans. And so it was not considered educational enough to be on the Pan Am grounds or to be on any World's Fair grounds. But Buffalo Bill Cody was smart enough to know that people wanted to see his show. So what he would do is he would come into wherever the World's Fair was. Chicago, he set up next to the Midway. Buffalo, he set up on the far side of Elmwood Avenue across from the Pan Am grounds to capitalize on this large group of people that were coming, but who wanted to see his show, even if it wasn't technically part of the Pan Am. So in response to not having Buffalo Bill on the grounds, most organizers created their own indigenous, what they called an Indian Congress, where they portrayed, very stereotypical portrayals of Native Americans, from cliff dwellers to Plains Indians. Everybody lived in a teepee. It just, as I said, it doesn't sit well with us today. In the center, the figure there is Geronimo, who was at the time a federal prisoner, but they let him out to come to Buffalo and sell, his autograph and photographs of himself at the Pan Am grounds. This headdress is in the collection of the Buffalo Museum of History. And here is my favorite story of the Pan Am. That is, and I'm going to use the language of the time, that is Winona the Sioux Princess, the greatest trick shot artist in the country. There's a different story here. That is Lillian Smith. She was a Quaker from Massachusetts who, in her late teens, fled her home in Massachusetts and wound up, go back to our guy, with Buffalo Bill as a trick shot performer. But Buffalo Bill already had a trick shot performer. Who did he have?
Annie Oakley.
Annie Oakley, right. Annie Oakley did not like competition. So she drove Lillian Smith out of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. And she hit the road by reinventing herself. Entire backstory from the Red Rock Reservation, the reservation in South Dakota, daughter of a Sioux chief, and portrayed herself in Sioux regalia during these shows, and then performed these amazing trick shot, acts. But when you know the backstory and now you look at her, I can't look at her in any pictures and not see her as Lillian Smith. I'm like, how did they not figure this out? They didn't. But there's a really fascinating footnote. When she died in 1930, 1932, her will specified that she was to be buried in her full Sioux regalia. And she was, because this became her persona through the World's Fairs and beyond. And you'll see her, she's like big billing. Geronimo, Princess Winona, right there on the entrance to the Indian Congress. So you have those stereotypical representations. And then you've got these, there is no other way to put this, racist displays on the Midway. I think it's important to remember where we are in 1901 as a country. This is a country that is, struggling from a failed Reconstruction after the Civil War. Reconstruction ends not because the goals of integrating the freed enslaved people into American culture had succeeded, but because Garfield struck a deal to remove soldiers from the South in return for, the votes he needed to become president. So It's not because we'd accomplished the goals. And the argument is that the South may have lost the Civil War, but they won the peace. That the South was very successful in redefining the goals of the Civil War, that it was not about fighting to preserve slavery, but instead it was about, states' rights and the lost cause, and look how valiantly the Southerners fought against the overwhelming odds of the North. That whole redefinition was critical. McKinley was the last president who was a Civil War vet, but we'd had a number of presidents leading up: Harrison, Garfield, Grant, I'm missing one, that were all Civil War veterans. So the Civil War was still very much a thing in 1900. And as we said, if the South is in the process of redefining it, Old Plantation is exactly the picture of that redefinition. It portrayed African Americans from the South who were not actually from the South. You entered through what looked like an old antebellum plantation house into an area where this is supposed to be the log cabin that Abraham Lincoln was born in. Ironically, it was sitting right next to the log cabin where Jefferson Davis was supposed to be born in. So talk about the lost cause. You've got, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, his cabin sitting side by side with the log cabin of Abraham Lincoln. That there was no, there was no contradiction in putting those two together. There was a field of cotton planted within the old plantation South. The performers in there would pick it throughout the season. They performed dances. This is a cakewalk, which was typically performed, was allowed by plantation owners to be performed with the winning dance couple receiving a cake, hence a cakewalk. This is a stereo card of the cakewalk being performed here in Buffalo. And so we look at this and it does not sit well. The dancers were called to perform with the ringing of a bell that had been used on a plantation to call slaves to the fields. And then across, and I don't think there's any coincidence that it's across, because as the country was, redefining itself in these terms of, Plessy, Ferguson, separate but equal, the African Americans in the United States in 1900 were portrayed as descendants of the Africans from darkest Africa. And it's exactly what you would expect. It's stereotypical portrayals. They talk about cannibals. They talk about pygmies, poison, arrows, headhunters. There's no language that allows, and trust me, I've written hundreds of pages on it. The language just makes this so hard. In the middle, the guy with the white beard and the pith helmet is a man named Javier Pinay. He's a French, pick your term, anthropologist, businessman, ivory trader, who was hired by the Buffalo Academy of Natural Sciences, today the Science Museum, to go to Africa and recruit about 100 indigenous people from Africa to come to Buffalo and portray African culture. And it's interesting because this is not his first go at this. He's done 2 World's Fairs prior to this with African exhibits. So he's an old hand at this. What I find interesting, and it is part of my thesis, is when you look at him, he goes from being on the billboard to being with the people to now being enthroned in the middle of these Africans that he has brought from the west coast of Africa to Buffalo. They do war dances. Again, not my language, their language. There are craftsmen. One of the interesting things is there is a lot of controversy on all of these midways up through the 1930s about acceptable lack of clothing. We put it that way, because the less developed the culture, the more acceptable levels of undress were. So remember, the women who are going to come view this, the men who are going to come view this, shirt and tie, dress to the collar, dress to the cuff, dress to the ankle, encountering Africans. And in fact, there was a board of morality that inspected the midway exhibits, shut a couple down, demanding that the women get a little bit more clothing on. And this was one as well, because it's Central Africa. And so the concessionaires, the people who owned the concession, agreed to have the African women especially wear more clothing, but argued that, hey, but you're violating our purpose here, which is you wanted us to portray authentic African life, but if we're putting on more clothing on our performers, our interpreters, then it's not actually authentic. But they did, because otherwise they would have been closed down. This is Disney on the Midway. And again, if I had limited time, I'm going beeline straight to Trip to the Moon for my first moment at the Pan Am. This was Pirates of the Caribbean in 1901. You entered this gigantic concession called Trip to the Moon. You walked out onto a gangplank, and sitting there, much like the boats of Pirates of the Caribbean, or any, one of those Disney attractions, was the Starship Luna, looked just like this, wings flat. And you got on, and then through a series of lighting and electrical effects and a cyclorama, a large painting, the ship began to rock, it began to move, you took off, and you were taking off from Buffalo to the moon. And here you can see, spotlighted the Pan Am and the electric tower, the falls and the mist. And then you went further and further until you landed on the moon. You went into a cave. Through the cave, there were, moon maidens who had green cheese, because of course in 1901 everybody knew the movie was made of green cheese. So you had a little sample of green cheese. You went into the throne room of the King of the Moon. There was dances, there was this reception, but here's what I love. At least Disney took you back home. With the Pan Am, with Trip to the Moon, after the last dance was done, they literally opened a door, kicked you back out, and right back onto the Midway. Now, people were convinced up to that moment that they were on the moon. They believed they had left Buffalo until this door opens and you're just kicked back out. But this is that type of immersive attraction that you see in places like Disney World today. Now, we can't talk about the Pan Am without talking about the assassination of McKinley. And as we get into the 125th now, this is our big focus. In the fall will be the 125th anniversary of McKinley's assassination. Shawgloss was the assassin. I've always maintained that there was nothing unique about Buffalo in terms of why the assassination took place here. Shawgloss, whether he was a socialist or an anarchist, remains unclear. At his trial, he refused to speak, so we don't really know what his motivation was. But he had tracked McKinley here. He had bought a .38 caliber Iver Johnson revolver at a hardware store on Main Street with the intention of shooting the president. McKinley came on September 5th. When he arrived by train, they were at the north end of the Pan Am grounds, and they had arranged a 21-gun salute. But they had put the artillery too close to the train, so when they fired the guns, it blew out all the windows in the presidential car. That should have been McKinley's sign to go home, but he stayed. Toured the Pan Am grounds, gave his famous speech, World's Fairs are the timekeepers of progress. We all quote it today. And then he went the next day to visit the power plant in Niagara Falls and came back to greet visitors at the Temple of Music. He was big on, greeting people, and he had an interesting way of doing it. He would reach forward to shake your hand, and as he was shaking, he would pull you towards him, put his hand on your back, and kind of move you through, and then reach for the next person. So kind of an assembly line kind of thing. Shawgloss is in the line in the Temple of Music. He has the revolver under a handkerchief in his hand, and as McKinley reaches for him, he reaches out with the revolver and fires 2 shots. The first strikes McKinley, who, as you can see from actually, Raphael back here kind of trimmed a little bit. McKinley was a big man. We just go there. The first shot struck him in the breastbone and did not penetrate. The second struck him in the abdomen, and then, well, as you're going to see, got lost. Shawgloss is quickly apprehended. There's a African-American waiter from one of the concessions behind him. Big Jim Parker picks him up, slams him to the ground, police arrest him. There's no Secret Service formally at this point. McKinley is taken to a hospital, an emergency hospital that exists on the ground. Interestingly enough, it's still there today. It's an immediate care. Love that. But it was not designed for surgery. So McKinley, it's clearly one of the bullets penetrated. Now, if you were in Buffalo in 1901, and you needed surgery, there was one guy you wanted to do the surgery. That was Roswell Park. Now, I'm going to tell you the story, and I'm going to tell you that I doubt its authenticity, but I love telling the story anyway, because there's a kernel of truth. So Park was in Niagara Falls performing surgery when McKinley was shot. The legend is that a telephone call was made to the hospital, and that a runner went into the surgery theater and said, "Dr. Park, they need you." And Park is alleged to have said, "I could not leave the surgery right now if it was for the President of the United States," which of course it was. Now, whether Park said that or not, it doesn't matter. He was not available. surgeon who was a doctor who was available was an OBGYN named Matthew Mann. Now, I say that not to disparage Dr. Mann, okay, being an OBGYN, that's not the point. He was, by all accounts, a competent doctor, and people thought well of it. But if you're looking for a bullet, a very small bullet in a very large man, you probably want somebody who's got a little bit more experience in this. Now, what was over in the patent office, the government building? The X-ray machine, right. Had they brought the X-ray machine out to the hospital, they might have found the bullet. But they couldn't. So Mann traces the path of the bullet. Now, today we know that it went transversely kind of through the president, nicked the colon, nicked the kidney, and then kind of gets lost somewhere back here. Mann couldn't find the bullet. So he decided, and this is where we start to have some problems, that if he can't find it, the bullet must have just passed out. Because there's no bullet. So he doesn't drain the wound, sews the president up, and sends him off to John Milburn's house to recover. And for a couple of days, everything looks fine. People come to visit him, the cabinet comes to town, Roosevelt comes to town, and after a couple of days, and it looks like McKinley's going to recover, everybody leaves. And then it takes a turn. By September 14th, McKinley dies. Roosevelt's at the top of a mountain in the Adirondacks, races in the dead of the night, down the side of the mountain on a train car, arrives mud spattered at the Wilcox Mansion, for the inauguration. Shawglass, in an interesting twist, is convicted in a 2-day trial. He refuses to speak. The jury takes 24 minutes to deliberate, because they were criticized for taking too long, and ultimately winds up in Auburn and becomes one of the first convicts executed by electrocution, the electric chair. So the Electric City has an odd footnote with Shawglass at the being electrocuted. And this goes to the legend of, McKinley's death is the curse of Buffalo. And I will argue that it's not. The Pan Am had better days after McKinley died. The city had better years after the Pan Am, even though it lost money. That the curse of Buffalo, or the Bills, separate those two later, goes far beyond McKinley. It has to do with the Great Depression and World War II and the St. Lawrence Seaway, and nothing to do with the fact McKinley was assassinated. You could argue that, in fact, this was a turning point in American history because of Roosevelt. Pretty good chance had McKinley lived, Roosevelt would not have been back on the ticket. We might not have had a President Teddy Roosevelt. But eventually the Pan Am closes. Some of the buildings are sold off. We know the building that's in the annex of the History Museum was sold to a family in West Seneca. They used this playhouse for 100 years. The Wisconsin building wound up in Point Avenue. It is still there. But for the most part, the buildings were torn down. This is January of 1902. So you can see, the light fixtures are still hanging there. This is darkest Africa, looking towards the streets of Cairo. But that it's begun to be torn down. Interior stuff like copper piping and those sorts of things were taken out. And there was actually a catalog of stuff, especially the next city coming up. So Charleston, concessionaires could buy stuff. But much of it was simply knocked down, plowed into the canals, and then buried over. By 1909, that area is beginning to be developed as an area called Nye Park. Now, you're looking down Lincoln Parkway, but you'll notice here that much of the ground still bears the traces of the Pan Am. Through the 1950s, when they're building houses there, they go in for the foundations, they're still turning up big chunks of the staff, of that material that was used to create these buildings. Pan Am grounds. There are a number of myths. By the way, this is not it's an actual photo. We colorized using AI, fair disclosure. But we've colorized a couple, and they're fascinating to look at, just to see what it might have. This is one more of the parade. That elephant in the middle is Jumbo the elephant, displayed by Frank Bostock, who had the animal concession. And he'd been having trouble with Jumbo, the Indian war elephant. And so he decided, since he'd lost money on the Pan Am, he would make his money back in the last day by electrocuting the elephant. There's no ending to this, I wouldn't tell you the story. So he sells tickets, 12,000 seats, fills the stadium, marches the elephant out, hooks electrodes to the elephant, and forgets that the elephant's hide is so thick, when he throws the switch, nothing happens. So it has no, that's why we tell the story of Jumbo, because it turns out okay, though the intention, not so much. This is one of my favorite concessions. This is Voltaire's house upside down. You entered through what would be the attic of the house, worked your way to the center, where there are a series of illusions that took place, live action illusions. There's a myth that the house was turned right side up and is over on the west side of Buffalo. It's not, because of course the house was not ever designed to be a real house. There are a number of buildings that still exist, most notably the History Building. Designed as the New York State Building for the Pan Am with the intention that it would survive. There isn't a move to use the World's Fairs as a municipal good until the last fair in this era in San Diego in 1916. At that point, they created part of the park that's outside of the San Diego Zoo to survive the fair. But in most of the cities, there's like one thing, and for us, it was the History Museum. So I love this picture of it and under construction. This is the lakeside view of it during the Pan Am, before Lincoln sat out there, and of course, what it looks like today. In the foreground, you have the bridge that I mentioned earlier. It's called the Bridge of the Three Americas. It is still there, although most of us miss it most of the time. South America, Central America to North America. It was the city's gift or contribution to the Pan Am grounds. The casino building also still remains. And I love this one because they were racing canoes on the lake during the Pan Am in front of the casino. And I apologize for this. I couldn't get over to get a better, I have to replace it. But casino is still there. And as we said, there are a number of smaller buildings. Actually, part of Darkest Africa wound up in Canada as well. It was destroyed by fire. The Wisconsin building is still there. The small concession came from West Seneca back to the History Museum. But for the most part, there was no intention that these buildings would ever survive beyond the months of the Pan Am. We are currently in the process of building a touchscreen. In fact, it is 99% done on my end. And when you go to the History Museum or the TR site, once these are up, hopefully middle of July, you'll be able to touch on any building in the Pan Am. I'm going to say any building. The reality is we've only been able to find images of about 90%. But that is still far greater than any other project has done at documenting and creating images of the Pan Am. When you go and you open it up, if this works, hang on 1 second. So you'll have an interactive map. Any building that is outlined in white, which, as I said, will be almost everything once we get there. You'll have a pop-up of what the exhibit was, and then we've got a series of images here, in this case, of the Inuit exhibit out on the Midway. And you'll be able to do that. And this will be accessible through the web. So we're also working right now on new signage in the Heritage District. And we'll have a link to the touchscreen on those signs. So you're standing on Lincoln Parkway at Fordham, want to know more about the Temple of Music, you use the link, and now you've got this touchscreen with all of its data right in your hand, on your phone, your tablet, standing right there at Lincoln and Fordham near the Temple of Music. So it'll both have a presence at both the museum and the TR site, but also it will live on the web as well. These are the Maple Barnes scrapbooks. They are just a fascinating look. They are, I want to say authentic, that's not correct. But they're not solely her experiences on the Pan Am grounds. There are some. She writes about Venice in America, where you got the gondolas. But it also was like a little Italian village. They had the Rialto Bridge and the Bridge of Sighs and a restaurant. And she writes about having spaghetti at Venice in America and how that must have been exactly how spaghetti tasted in Venice. You know, there is no way that the spaghetti served in Venice in America tastes like freshly made pasta in Venice. But in her mind, that was the experience. But in other places, she uses guidebooks and other publications from the Pan Am and writes she's almost like dictating like the formal views of especially the Midway concession. So it's an interesting mix of her experiences over 20 times, written both herself and her students to the Pan Am, but then also incorporating a lot of the formal literature of the Pan Am as well. So if you're looking for some other ways to explore the Pan Am, certainly the History Museum, Teddy Roosevelt site are great. We have stuff from the Pan Am in the Continuum exhibit at the History Museum, the gun, the shackles from Shawglass. The Teddy Roosevelt site is opening a new exhibit August 1st called 11 days in September. And it's a look at the Roosevelt assassination, or not the McKinley assassination, the Roosevelt inauguration, and what was happening in Buffalo those 10 days. And it's great. outside Milburn's house, there was a chalkboard. And every morning they would put the president's like heart rate, blood pressure, urine output. You look at the data that they put on that chalkboard for the media and you're like, why did anybody need to know that? But they thought it was showing the McKinley's progress. So it's going to be, so that exhibit opens August 1st at the TR site through the fall. So lots and lots of stuff going on. But if you're looking for a couple of things to read, Margaret Creighton's Electrifying Fall focuses on some of the more unusual stories. Chiquita, the doll woman, who ran away from her concession and was caught and brought back. The Execution of Jumbo. It's a little bit more of some of those high profile stories. Austin Fox's book is a much more architectural look. It's around, Cary Grant's book was published for the centennial and collects a lot of stories in ephemera, but it doesn't really tell a narrative. You've probably seen this one, Leary and Scholl's Pan-American Exposition, lots and lots of pictures. But in writing, and I've written a couple of these for Arcadia, they don't want a story. They want pictures and a caption, which there's a lot of that here, but it doesn't tell a compelling narrative because that's not what the publisher wants. But great images, a lot of interior shots of what was in the building. And Robert Rydell, who is the guru of World's Fairs out at the University of Montana, has a book called All the World's Fair, and it talks about the fairs of this era, and Buffalo features prominently. I recommend any of his stuff, but certainly a good starting point is All the World's Fair. And I guess my thought is, I think we're still missing the definitive work on the Pan Am. There's lots of stuff, but I don't think there's one book that really tells the story in a way that's compelling. And maybe once I get my thesis done, that'll be my next project. Because I think there's still a place for a real big overall look at the Pan Am. And that is only touching the surface. Questions? I run even long for me. Are there questions I can answer? Yeah.
Was it safe to be in those temporary buildings? Like,
yeah, I mean, they all had a wooden structure. I mean, so there was a skeleton that the staff was applied to, but by late October, chunks are falling off because the water's gotten into the plaster and they've begun to they're falling apart. The buildings themselves were not structurally dangerous, but yeah, you might catch a hat full of plaster towards the end of the fair. Yeah, it just wasn't designed to be long-term. Yeah.
What's going on in the electric tower itself? You went in there.
Yeah, so in the electric tower, there were elevators that took you up to, let me see if I can get back real faster. So there's an observation deck. Electric tower. There we go. Yeah, so the bottom part was this fountain and colonnade and waterfall. You took the elevators up. There was an observation deck and a restaurant at this level, and then a spiral staircase that took you up to a higher observation deck, even higher still. But there are accounts of people hearing rumbles of thunder heading for the elevator, because that is not where you wanted to be. So restaurant observation deck is largely, there were not displays in the center column. That was the infrastructure for the elevators that took you up 200. I think restaurant was like 275 feet, if I remember right.
At one place, you just passed it with a large face of water.
Yeah, Dreamland. Yeah.
I saw something like that outside of a building.
On Forest.
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, for the centennial, that building is the History Museum Annex. So it's like that's where the collections are housed. It's actually an old Buffalo streetcar bar. And so for the centennial, they redid the outside to look like, it's called the Lady Left, which was the entrance to Dreamland as Hall of Mirrors. But I don't think it's still there. I think they took it like the original Pan Am. After 20 years, it was starting to weather. But yeah, that's the History Museum Annex.
It was a long time ago when I saw it. I couldn't get my grandkids to go in.
Yeah, they did that for the centennial. Yeah.
how long did the Pan Am last?
Pan Am opened in May. It opened late May 15th and closed November 1st, 1901. So it's that 8 months. 7 months. Yep. And that was all it was ever intended to do. Anyway. Yeah.
A fictional story about the evolution of elevators. And they were talking about an Olympians Roosevelt sitting there elevator board. Is there a truth to that?
Oh, that's an interesting. I don't know. I've never come across that. I've never read who installed the elevators in the electric tower. I'm sure we've got it, but that's just not something I've come across. But
Maybe it didn't happen.
I will have to look into it. I mean, that's a pretty, for the time, that's a good size opening in a building that has a steel structure, but it's not a really, building built for long haul. I'll have to look into that. That's interesting.
Yeah, a lot of excellent pictures here of the Pan-Am exhibition. About, yeah, like websites, or where did you get a lot of these pictures that you showed today?
The pictures come from the collection of the Buffalo History Museum. So in the History Museum library, which is open to the public, you can go in and you can see the Maple Barnes journals. The fact they're online is, I think, an advantage. I used them in microfilm for years and years and years. But they have boxes and boxes and boxes of photos. And so, they're part of the museum collection. They have a huge collection of Pan Am construction. They have images of, as we said, we're about 85, 90% of every building, major building certainly, that were there. There are scrapbooks. There's vertical files of, especially like advertising from the manufacturers building. Companies that were there had takeaways for everybody who came. And so they have a huge collection of 12 boxes of the ephemera that came from the Pan Am. So and then some of the artifacts are from, I'm a Pan Am collector, from my collection as well. But the pictures are from the History Museum.
Okay, so you're in the research library, the Buffalo History Museum?
Yep, there's a new research librarian. There was kind of a gap there, like January, February, March. They just hired Alex about a month ago. She's excellent. And she replaces Cynthia Van Ness, who was kind of the rock star of librarians in Western New York. But their staff is always outstanding to work with.
So people can.
Yeah, open to the public, but you need a research appointment, and those can be booked on the Buffalo History Museum website under research.
Oh, so you need to make an appointment?
You need to make an appointment. The research library is not open every day all the time. There are windows of time, and in those windows you need an appointment to do research, but that said, it's open to anybody. Yep.
I think the best place that I really saw a lot is pictures of the Pan-American Exposition. Was it Teddy Roosevelt inaugural?
Yes.
Upstairs, they got like, I guess, some computers.
Yep.
And they just got a wealth of information. You can just click on all these black and white pictures of the exposition. It's fantastic.
Yeah, there was an official, here we go. So there's an official photographer named C.B. Arnold. He had done Chicago, did Buffalo, did Jamestown Exposition in 1907, lived in Buffalo. And so there are so he sold a book of photographs and it was cut out to look like Buffalo had. He did, there were souvenir collections of photographs, but they're pretty much all the same. But then the TR site has stuff, and they've been digitizing their stuff on New York State Digital Archive, where you can go and search by, if you want to find something on the electric tower, you search and it'll show you all of the images that they have digitized. So what's in their collection is also available online as well. That's the great thing. So much of this now, 20 years ago, it was, you had to go and sit in the library for hours, and now much of it is digitized and available at home.
You can get it on the internet.
Yep. Oh, for sure. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if there was a website, what the website was.
Starting point, the TR website has a link to their digitized collection.
Okay,
So Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site. Buffalo History Museum has some of their collection digitized. Theirs is obviously much bigger, but some of the Pan Am stuff and Maple Barnes diaries are digitized, and they're a blast just to read. One more, and then I know we will hold that break. Go.
Are you giving this talk to the general public at some point outside of University Express?
Not at the moment, but I'm always available if any group's looking for but so far, right now, this is my spring University Express one, so. Great. I apologize for holding you this long. Thanks for coming, and like I said, look for a lot of stuff happening in the next 7 months, much like the original.